Today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. It's Sunday in most of the world at the moment, and it's fantastic that you've given up your Sunday to be part of this, our third stand-up paddling webinar, and we're very excited today to have his master's voice, I suppose, Mr. Stand-up paddling, Larry Cain, super coach, former Olympic gold medalist, of course. Well, I've always wondered, Larry, why they say former, because you're always Olympic gold medalist, so you're an Olympic gold medalist.
It was a long time ago, though.
Yeah, but still, they can never take that away from you. Our webinar today is going to be pretty interesting because Larry's very experienced as a coach, and he's going to be able to show a lot of you things that you've not tried before and give you some new ideas for training and competition, etc. Big thanks, as always, to Starboard, our partner for these webinars. Fantastic to be teaming up with Starboard. And I should just mention at the top before we get into it that Larry does do private coaching as well. Paddle Monster is the name of his company. If you look up Paddle Monster, you can hook up with Larry and he can organize some private training. I mean, who doesn't want to be trained by an Olympic gold medalist and somebody who's as experienced as he is? Just for those who are joining us for the first time, Larry will take questions, and the best way to register your question is to go to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Please don't put the questions in the chat line, put them in the Q&A, and then I can monitor them and throw them at Larry during the presentation. If you go onto that tab and you see a question that you really like and would like to have answered, just like the question, and then the more likes that question gets, the higher it gets on the list, so more chance of it being asked. We are recording today's session, so it will be available online in a couple of days' time for those of you who want to relive the best moments or to share it with friends, make people aware that it is available. We're also streaming live on Facebook as well. We've got people from all over the world joining us. Larry, I'm going to throw it over to you. Good luck with the presentation. Keep those questions coming in, folks, and I'll join you a little bit later on this morning. Good luck, Larry.
Cheers. Thanks, Ross. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining. I'm just going to see if I can make this bigger. There we go. Thank you for joining me today. It's a pleasure to do this webinar. And I want to first start by thanking the International Canoe Federation, not just for their efforts to help stand-up paddling grow by doing these webinars and hosting a world championship, a great world championship last year and another one due this June in Hungary. But I could also thank them for years and years of great competitions that I was able to attend. And I wouldn't be here in front of you today if it wasn't for the experiences that I had racing sprint canoes. So thank you to the ICF. And then also I want to thank Starboard for their involvement in these webinars, in helping our sport grow, and for 5 years of personal support to me as well. It's a privilege to be part of the Starboard team. And I've got a lot of respect for everyone involved with Starboard, their approach to not just designing equipment, which I think is top-notch, the best out there, but also to the environment and as well to developing the sport. And I should say that when you have people like the ICF and Starboard making these efforts to develop the sport, we all win because the sport gets better. It advances, there's more competitive opportunities for everybody, more opportunities to participate and get out in the water, and that's what it's all about. So I wanted to talk today to you about technique. And one of the things that I do in this business, Paddle Monster, is it's an online subscription-based coaching service that we provide. And it's real easy to work with people on training in an online form where you don't necessarily see people that you're working with. You communicate with them online or you communicate with them via Zoom calls, but it's harder to work on technique. And I come from a background in sprint canoe where it's common to have a coach with you regularly, if not daily, then at least multiple times during the week, where you're getting feedback not just on the work that you're doing, but how you're doing it technically. And there's really 3 pillars to performance in our sport. The first is aerobic abilities, and then also higher level cardiovascular abilities like your anaerobic fitness as well. But the second is strength, because I do think it takes a good deal of strength to move these boards through the water effectively. And then the third is technique. And when you don't pay attention to one of them, then everything doesn't come through to its maximum. You don't get your maximum return for the time that you're investing. And with technique, it's probably the most important of the three, because you can be you can have very good technique and not be in tremendous fitness, and you can still perform fairly well. But I've seen the fittest people in the world with poor technique, and they just can't compete. So it really is important. So I wanted to spend some time today talking about technique, doing some demonstrations, giving you some ideas of things to look for and to look out for, some common mistakes that people make and what the corrections for them are. And then if you have any questions, please ask them. I'll try to answer as many as I can. And certainly I can talk about other aspects as well. I can talk about training and racing and equipment or anything else that you want to know about. But I really do think that it's best to talk about technique. So with that in mind, I'd like to start by saying that when I started paddling, stand-up paddling, I transitioned from sprint racing canoes from C1. And I did find that paddling on a stand-up board was like C1, but standing up. The difference being that in canoe, I only paddled on the right side. And when I got on a stand-up board, I had to paddle on left and right. And you can imagine that initially my right side was very strong and my left side was non-existent. It took a lot of learning to be able to paddle, to just actually be able to have good balance on the left, let alone paddle effectively. And I remember at the time too that the first time I went to a major competition, it was the old Battle of Paddle in Dana Point, California. And the top guys in the world at that time were Connor Baxter and Kai Lenny, both quite young, and Danny Ching, who was a little bit older but still young by my standards. And it was interesting because I was still trying to figure out how I was going to paddle on a stand-up paddleboard, and everybody else that was competing there. And it's a huge competition with obviously all the top pros, but hundreds of other non-professional racers participating as well. And everyone would be talking about the way that these three guys paddled, and they were trying to paddle like them. And I started to think about it, and it made no sense to me, because not only were these three guys younger than me by a considerable amount, but they were lighter. They weren't as tall. Connor's as tall as I am now, but in fact, he might be a little taller, but he wasn't at the time because he was a young guy and still growing. I think I was stronger than they were just from my sprint canoe background, but I didn't have any of the ocean skills that those guys had. By that point in my sport career, I was probably not as fit aerobically as those guys were. So you can see right away that I'm different than they are. And so why should I be paddling exactly the same way that they are? It didn't seem to make sense to me. And if you consider everybody who's on our webinar today, and Hoi Chan told me that there was going to be up to 400 people registered for this today. I don't know whether all 400 of you are on here, but suppose, for example, that there were 400 people watching this today. If you lined all 400 people up and you started looking at all 400 of us and, for height and weight, you'd quickly find that not everyone is the same. And even if you could find a group of people that was the same height and the same weight, if you started to dig down deeper and look at their bodies more closely, you'd find that they weren't the same beyond height and weight. If you started measuring them anthropometrically, where you're measuring the length of their long bones between their joints, you'd find that some people have more of their length in their lower body. Some people have more of their length or their height in their upper body. Some people's, femurs, their upper leg bone are longer. Some people have shorter femurs. Some people, their arms, their upper arm, their humerus is longer. Some people, it's shorter. We're all different shapes and sizes. Even if you measured them anthropometrically and you found a few people that were matches, you could dig down deeper still and you could start to look at where muscles originate and insert across joints, and you'd find that those origins and insertions were probably in different places on the bone, which would then give each individual a little bit different mechanical advantage when those joints were working. You could start to look at the levels of muscle fibers. Some people have more fast twitch muscle fiber. Some people have a higher percentage of slow twitch muscle fiber. You could start to look at people's cardiovascular abilities. Some people are better developed aerobic systems. Some people have better anaerobic abilities, better ability to tolerate lactic acid. There's so many differences between individuals that it becomes really foolish to think that everyone should be paddling the same way, or that somebody who is, 175 centimeters tall should be paddling the same way as somebody who's 190 centimeters tall. It's nonsensical, really. And so if you think about people having a unique physical, a unique set of physical tools or a unique toolkit, then it shouldn't be about trying to paddle like somebody else when they have a different toolkit than you have. What you should be doing is you should be trying to find a way that optimizes the tools you have, and so that you can paddle most effectively for what you bring to the table. And so accordingly, you shouldn't be looking at how somebody paddles so much in terms of how they move their body or what they look like, but you should be looking at what they do with their paddle to make their board go through the water, and some basic principles of what they do with their body to make their board go through the water. So I want to talk about 6 basic things that we should all be trying to do. How we do them is going to depend on our toolkit, right? And so I'll talk about these 6 things, and then I'll start talking to you about ways that things that we can try, each of us, that with our own unique set of tools that can hopefully maximize our ability to do those 6 basic things. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So the first thing, and I'm going to get up, and I'll get up and sit down and move around here because I want to demonstrate some things. The first thing that I wanted to explain is that I'm actually going to use I brought a Dragon Boat paddle with me because it's a little bit easier to do things with in a tight, confined space like this room here. So the first thing is, the most important principle of all paddle sports is that what we want to do is we want to reach forward with our paddle, have the blade go into the water and gather water on the face of the blade. We want to hold water on the face of the blade so the blade is secure in the water. We want to pull ourselves to the paddle. And then when the paddle gets close to our body, we can't really pull ourselves to the paddle anymore. At this point, we want to push ourselves past it and then get the blade out of the water. So it's a constant pulling yourself to the paddle and pushing yourself by it. That's what's moving a paddlecraft forward in the water. It's not a case of pulling your paddle through the water. It's securing your blade in place and then pulling yourself to the paddle and pushing yourself past it. That's principle number 1, and it is the most important thing that you can ever think about when you're paddling. The second fundamental that I think you need to recognize and pay attention to is that we want to use big muscles preferentially over small muscles to produce the power that we use to work against the water that we have gathered on our blade. Okay, so big muscles in our body are quads, hamstrings, glutes, the muscles that cross our hips. Our hips are the most heavily muscled joint in our body, so we have to use our hips to provide the power to work against the water gathered on our blade, to pull ourselves to the paddle. So the muscles of our core are qualified as big muscles as well. The muscles in our upper body, like our lats, our chest, they're small in comparison to our legs. And although most paddle sports we think of as being upper body sports, and I come from a canoe background where my legs were fixed in position in my canoe, they moved around, but they didn't produce a lot of the power. My hips did, but not so much my legs. Stand-up paddling is a little different because we're standing. We have the ability to use our legs a lot more. And our upper body we should be thinking of our upper body as basically a connector between the water that we have loaded on the face of the blade, the water that's gathered in the face of the blade that we're going to pull against to move ourselves forward, and the big muscles that can produce that power. Muscles across our hips, our legs, muscles in our core. Okay, so even our lats, to some degree, are just connectors. When we put that blade in the water and connect, our lats tend to tighten up a little bit, and they help to connect what I'm going to do with my legs and my hips to the water that's loaded on my blade. And in that sense too, my arms are just connectors. And you know, your arms are really small muscles compared to the muscles in your legs. Your biceps and triceps are very small. So you don't really want to be pulling with them because you're using small, inefficient muscles when you could be using big muscles that are designed for producing power. The other muscle group that I should point out that a lot of people try to use and then they shouldn't are the muscles in your low back, right? These muscles are really postural muscles. These are the muscles that we use when we're standing up all day. When I was coaching and I would be at regattas all day, I'd call this regatta back. It gets a sore back from standing all day. When I was teaching in a classroom or in a gym, I would get a sore back from standing all day. These muscles are not made to produce power. And so we don't want to be doing a lot of this kind of motion when we're paddling, where we're trying to pull against our paddle or against the water gathered on our paddle blade. You know, we load down like this and then we try to come up and we're doing it from our low back. We don't want to do that. Those muscles are not strong and they're not made to produce power. So we want to find other ways to do that. And I'll show you how to use the bigger muscles as we move on. The third fundamental principle is that we want to use our body weight, okay? So body weight comes into play in two areas. The first is that if we can get our body weight on top of our paddle, we can use the force of gravity acting on our body weight, and that force can be applied to the water that's gathered on the face of the blade in addition to the forces that our muscles are exerting. And so body weight can complement what our muscles are trying to do and make our stroke more powerful. The second way that body weight's really important is that any body weight that comes off of your board and goes onto your paddle is going to make the board sit a little bit higher in the water. Okay, and the higher your board sits in the water, the less resistance to forward movement there is for the board. And the easier it is for that board to move across the water. And in truth, we shouldn't be thinking of our board moving through the water, like cutting through the water. We should be thinking of getting our board up on top of the water and skipping across the surface of the water, planing, and just skittering across the surface. That's how it's going to move fastest. And so the more we can get our body weight off of the board and onto our paddle, the lighter our board becomes. And if you want an example of that, just go to your bathroom scale and stand on it, see how much you weigh, and then grab your paddle and lean off your bathroom scale and lean on the paddle, and you should see a noticeable difference in the reading on the scale. That's weight that came off the board and is being taken by the paddle. And the same thing happens on the water. Okay, so we got to use our body weight. We have to find a way to use our body weight. That's essential. The fourth thing is that we want to do as much as we possibly can with a positive blade angle. So I'm going to use my draggable paddle again for this demonstration because it's nice and short. This is positive blade angle. This is when our blade is vertical. This is a negative blade angle. We want to do as much as we can from here to there. Everything past here is less efficient and less effective. When I was coaching with the Canadian Canoe kayak team, we had some pretty high-tech accelerometers and GPS devices that we could put on the boats when the athletes were training and racing to gather data that we could analyze. And I took one of those units and I put it on my paddleboard. And the results are the same on a paddleboard as they are on a sprint canoe and a kayak. And that is that when you enter the water with positive blade angle, and then you start to pull, you get a huge amount of acceleration. And that acceleration peaks at about the point where the blade is vertical. And then when the blade passes through vertical and starts to go negative, that acceleration, which peaked at vertical, begins to decline. It's your board or your boat is still accelerating. It doesn't start to decelerate. It is still accelerating right until the paddle comes out of the water, but the rate of acceleration is rapidly decreasing. So you have to ask yourself, why do I want to spend time? You know, I start my stroke with a positive blade angle. I start to pull, I get to vertical. This is where my acceleration is peaking. And then I start to get through in a negative blade angle. My acceleration starts to bleed off a lot. Why do I want to spend time back here when my acceleration is decreasing rapidly, when I could be back here again and have huge amounts of acceleration where my acceleration is increasing again, right? We want to spend as much time as we can in this area and as little time as we can in this area. Okay, so that's number 4. Number 5 is we want to try to maximize the run of our board or the speed that our board carries between strokes. And to do that, we need to be concerned about 2 things. Keeping a fairly level board that doesn't, you know, wobble around and that's going to cause extra drag. So we want it to be smooth as possible between strokes. We also want to make sure that we don't take too long in the air between strokes, because that's time, you know, you pull a stroke, the boat or the board, sorry, it climbs as it accelerates. And so now it's up on top of the water, which is where we want it, skipping across the surface. When the blade comes out of the water, there's no input that's causing it to accelerate, so it's going to start to sink back down. If we take too long, it's going to sink further and further and further, and now we got to get it up again in the next stroke. And when it sinks further and further and further into the water, it's slowing down more and more and more. So we want to minimize our air time. We minimize the time where our blade's not in the water. That's another way that we can maximize the run between strokes. And the last thing is, we want to make sure that the last thing we do with our paddle before we exit the water produces a good chunk of acceleration. And so that's, that comes down to what I was saying about we pull ourselves to the paddle and then we want to push ourselves past the paddle. That last push past the paddle is really, really important for making the board carry speed between strokes. And I'll show you some tips for how to get a real good push off the back of the stroke. So that's 5 things. The last thing I would say is that we want to have economy of motion. We don't want to have a lot of excess motion, because motion is produced by muscles working, and muscles working uses energy. And so we want to make sure that all the energy that our muscles are burning is being used to produce movement that moves the board forward, not excess movement that doesn't contribute to that forward movement of the board. And then the other thing too that you can think of is, Fiona mentioned this in the first webinar when she was talking about sprinting, and she referenced Connor being excellent at this, how he has his top hand just does these little circles, like he pulls a stroke and his top hand comes right back up instead of coming down and in like that and then up and over again. That is a lot of extra movement that we don't need, and it's movement that takes time. And if it's taking time when the blade's not in the water, it's slowing down the time between strokes, and it's going to cause you to lose speed between strokes, okay? So economy of motion is really important too. And you'll find that an effective stand-up paddling stroke is very compact motion. It's not like a huge reach. You know, you don't have to overreach. You need to reach effectively and not excessively, okay? So those are the 6 sort of fundamentals that we want to all try to achieve. How we achieve them is going to depend on our own unique set of physical tools, okay? So let's look at some tips that can help us achieve those 6 things better, okay? So the first thing I wanted to talk to you about is entering the water and gathering water on your blade. And so I'm going to use my stand-up paddle for this. And so one of the things that people do when they're standing on their board is they tend to actually stand like they do on land initially, right? They stand fairly straight. That's not going to help you get forward and get your weight forward so that your blade gets in the water and gathers water effectively. You've got to bend your legs. And so most people will think immediately, well, bend your legs like this, bend at your knees. There, I'm bending my legs. But the problem is that your weight, if you do this, is still directly over your feet, and it's not really forward. So the first thing that I think that you should be trying to think about when you bend your legs is to go for a bend at your ankles. Get more ankle flexion. Try to stand like that. So your legs, your knees, sorry, are over your toes. And for those of you that live in northern climates where you can alpine ski, this is a lot like wearing ski boots. All right, and in skiing, you get in this position because it helps keep your hips forward, your weight forward, and your weight over your tips, which allows you to carve your turns better. Well, in paddling, we'd like to have our weight forward as well, because what we want to do is we want to be in a position where when we go to catch the water, we're sort of losing our balance forward. If we get to a point where we're just feeling a little bit of instability and starting to topple forward, that means that when we get a little bit of rotation with our shoulders and start to reach forward, we start to sort of fall forward. That's going to cause our blade to go forward into the water as we contact the water, and it's going to cause the blade to get buried very quickly. One of the biggest mistakes that people make in stand-up paddling is they don't get the blade buried quickly enough. So if this is the surface of the water, their blade, when they go to catch the water, their blade starts moving back before they even catch the water a little bit. There's the water. Now the blade tips contact the water, but the blade is still moving back, and it doesn't get buried totally until it's almost vertical. That's a really common problem. And like a surprising number of people don't get their blade fully buried till it's vertical. Others do a little bit better, and they might get it buried at an angle like this, which is still not good. You want to try to get it buried as best you can out there, right? Like with a big positive blade angle out there. And when you can do that, not only are you then doing more with a positive blade angle, but you're able to get more of your body weight on the blade. Like if this paddle blade comes out of my hand right now, I topple forward, right? Because it's supporting my body weight. So if you can have ankle flexion, hips forward, knees bent, start to rotate, and as you feel like you're falling forward, the blade catches the water, it supports you, but it makes sure that the blade gets buried immediately with all of that positive blade angle. And if you think about it, now the blade's done a couple of things. It's supporting your body weight, so that takes care of using your body weight. It's buried with a bit of the positive blade angle, so that takes care of doing as much as you can with a positive blade angle and getting the benefit of all of that big acceleration you get at the front part of your stroke, okay? Because you put yourself in a position where your hips are forward, right? Your hips are forward. It gives you the opportunity now to engage your hips as you pull and use the most heavily muscled joint in your body. It also allows you now to use your legs as you use your hips, okay, against a fully loaded blade. And so, again, taking too long to get the blade buried is the biggest mistake that people make in paddling. And you can see just a small difference in how you stand on your board can help you avoid that problem. Another thing that you want to try to do or try to avoid, and will help you do this better, is I call it sitting in a chair. And so a lot of people, when they go to reach forward, they're reluctant to commit to the paddle. They are reluctant to trust that the paddle will take their body weight and support them, that they won't fall on the deck of their board or do a face plant into the water. And so what happens is that instead of going forward like that and letting the blade take their body weight, they tend to go forward like this. So they, as they're going forward, they sit back with their hips and counterbalance the forward weight of their upper body with their hips going backwards. And in this situation, my weight is centered squarely over my feet, which means when my blade goes in the water, my weight is not on my paddle blade to the same degree it is when I'm in this position. Okay? So sitting in a chair is bad for that reason, that you don't get as much body weight in the paddle, but it's also bad because if you're going back and sitting in a chair, and again, it's like, imagine there's a chair behind me, right? Like it looks like I'm about to sit my butt in a chair. If you're doing that and you catch the water in this position, how can you use your hips now? Your hips are already back, right? They can't go back really much more because they're already in a back position, and yet the blade just went in the water. So you take the opportunity to use the most heavily muscled joint in your body out of the equation because you use that to put the blade in the water rather than to pull against water that you end up loading up on your blade. Okay? So again, that's bad. This is good. Ankle flexion, hips forward, bent, knees bent, and letting the paddle take your body weight. Okay? And you can practice it just like I did there on land to get the feeling of doing that better. Okay? So that's the first thing. That sort of takes care of entering the water and gathering water on your blade. And a good visualization to think of is to think of the blade face. Think of that as being an extension of your hand. So if I asked you to reach into something like a big tub of popcorn at the movie theater or something, and asked you to get as many kernels of popcorn in your hand as you could, you'd reach in with your hand, you dig in deep, you get a whole bunch of popcorn, and then you'd eat it like this, right? That's the way you get your share, and because otherwise the kids are going to eat it all. You got to be able to do the same type of thing with your blade face. It's got to probe into the water, kind of probe forward, the tip probes into the water, and it's the whole time it's gathering water in the face of the blade, or it's loading up with water. Okay? Just like your hand would be if it was going into the popcorn. Okay, so try to visualize making the blade an extension of your hand. And that will really help you get a good amount of water loaded up on your paddle blade. So once you've got water loaded on your paddle blade, now you want to use the big muscles to pull against it, right? So I alluded to this earlier. You've got the blade in the water, you've got it loaded up. You'll notice that my reach isn't excessive here. I don't have this ridiculously positive blade angle. I've got a positive blade angle. You can see I've got some shoulder rotation, but I don't have a ton of it. I'm actually reaching more from as much from my feet as I am from the rest of my body. Look at the angle of my body. I'm actually kind of reaching forward, leaning forward from my feet. So that's another good visualization to think of. Lean forward from your feet. Once the blade's in the water and gathered water on the blade, the first thing you want to think about doing is using your hips to pull, right? So now you want to start to use your hips. Your hips are going to start to go back. And as soon as your hips have started to go back, start thinking about using your legs to get the blade a little bit deeper in the water, okay? And I like to call getting the blade deeper in the water loading the paddle. So we're loading the paddle when we gather water in the face of the blade, and we can continue to load the paddle all the way through to the point where a blade is vertical. And if you want to just simplify the stroke, just call that the loading phase, where we're loading body weight onto the paddle, okay? And we're loading force onto the paddle, We're loading the impact of our muscles onto the paddle. And then when we get to this point where the blade is vertical, remember, we don't want to end up back here. So there's something else we need to think about to avoid the second biggest mistake that people make in stand-up paddling. And this second biggest mistake is they get to a point where they've done a good job up here, perhaps, right? They've got the blade in the water quickly. They've loaded up on the paddle. They've used their legs and their hips. They've continued to load. And they get down here in this position, and it's like they get stuck. And they kind of stay here. And the only thing that moves is their hands and their arms and their paddle. Like that. And then they start to come up. And what happens is a couple of things. You'll note that the blade is at a really negative blade angle, which we don't want. Because remember, we get a huge decrease in acceleration the further negative it gets. But the other thing is, if we want to use big muscles all the time, there's a point here where we go from here, where we're using big muscles, and then we get to here, and now all that's happening is this. The only thing moving the paddle is my arms, maybe a bit of my shoulders to move my arms. But these are very small muscles moving the paddle right here. And so you have a point on your stroke from here, where you really finish loading, to here before you start to unload, where tiny muscles were moving the paddle. And that creates a real soft spot in your stroke. So what you want to try to do is when you catch and use your hips and your legs to load, you get to this point here, immediately, as soon as you're not going to load anymore, as soon as you're not going to go down anymore with your upper body, or bend anymore with your legs, or load any more body weight onto your paddle blade, and your blade's close to vertical, now you want to think about unloading, right? So loading, unloading. And the way to unload is think about pressure directed down the paddle shaft with your top hand, just enough to keep the blade stuck in the water. You don't have to think about doing this, driving it down with your top hand, just pressure, okay? Pressure keeps the blade stuck in the water here. And then what you're going to try to do is bring your hips forward underneath your body, and you're going to straighten your legs to their original bend. And this motion here, where your hips reload against a reload forward against a paddle that still has water gathered on the face of the blade, right? That is going to allow you to push yourself past the paddle. And so you're using your hips and your core here, and to a degree, you're using your legs in sort of a little squat, like that, pushing up with your legs to push against the paddle and push yourself past the paddle on the exit. Okay? So you get to a point there when you go from loading to unloading, you get to a point at that load-unload juncture, transition, you have an opportunity to make your stroke really effective by unloading immediately as soon as you finish loading. Okay, so I'm just going to show that one more time because it's important. So you load, right? And I'll move that chair so you can see. You load, and here you are fully loaded. And now you want to immediately, as soon as you get to this point, you start unloading and taking the blade out. And your body weight, your body's going to be in this legs forward, weight forward from your feet position. And you just have to get the blade back forward again to catch up when you're ready for the next catch, right? So that's good. Or you can be, if you have you load and then you have a lag before you start to unload, that's bad. And so that transition between loading and unloading can make or break the second half of your stroke. If you're late, you're going to have a problem. And one other thing I should say too is that when your blade goes, use the dragon paddle for this because it's easier to move around than canoe paddle, the stand-up paddle. When you get to this really negative blade angle, you know, we talked about how little acceleration it's providing. It's actually, a lot of people will comment on how if you lift up like that, it pulls the back of the board down, which you don't want. But the other problem is, the big problem is that if you get to here and you've loaded, and now you start to unload, bring your hips forward with water still in the blade, you're moving, your hips are changing direction, right? They're going back during the loading, and then they change and they start to move forward again, reload forward, and they're unloading. That change of direction, if it occurs with the blade in the water and supported with water in the face of the blade, it pushes you forward off the back of the stroke. But if that change of direction from hips moving back to moving forward again, if that occurs when the blade is out of the water or mostly out of the water, the board actually moves backwards. It jerks the board backwards. So I invite you to do this next time you're out on the water. Stand on your board and just stand still. Get in this position like you finished loading. Your hips are back, your legs are bent, your body's leaned over. Take the blade out of the water and stand up. The board jerks backwards. You can see it. So when your board's actually moving, when you're paddling, your board's not going to start moving backwards, but what's causing the board to jerk backwards when you're standing still is bleeding speed off of the board as it's traveling through the water. It's causing it to slow down. It's breaking some of that forward speed of the board. It means you're carrying less speed between strokes, okay? So vitally important that you have a quick, immediate transition between your loading and your unloading phase, okay? A couple of other things, hints that you can have is that when you're paddling, I don't know if you guys can see this, I drew the rails of a board in green tape on my floor here. So when you're paddling, when you're rotating forward, you're in your position where your knees are over your toes, you're in your ski boots, so you got lots of ankle flexion, your legs are bent, your hips are forward. When you're reaching forward, you know, you don't need excessive rotation, just like a comfortable rotation, a casual rotation. And then as you're reaching forward, you can sort of continue to go forward, right? Blade catches, your body weight supports you, gets buried really quickly. But notice, as I'm doing this, notice that I call it squared up, right? My top hand is directly over my bottom hand. My blade, as you're looking at it, is vertical. I'm not in this position like this. Okay, this position, if you're in this position, your top hand's inside the board, you're not getting your weight onto the paddle the way you should be. And moreover, you're paddling a considerable distance from the rail of the board, which is going to increase the turning effect each stroke has. Okay, and you don't want that. Obviously, you want to track as straight as possible. And I will spend a little bit of time, after I take some questions in a second, talking about how to track your board straight, okay? So these are the main tips I wanted to give you about how to use lower body, legs, and hips more, okay, than just standing up straight and paddling. I guess one other thing I just wanted to say about the loading in the way that I've described. When you're in this position and you go forward and you load, and then you use your hips and you use your legs to get the blade deeper, you'll notice that I don't change my angle at my waist a lot, right? I'm getting the blade deeper in the water. I'm loading the blade deeper in the water by using my legs and my hips moving back as more than I'm using my muscles in my low back to lean over more. You'll see a lot of people that paddle with fairly straight legs, and they'll paddle like this. And that, again, puts you into a position where you're starting to rely a lot on muscles that aren't really designed for producing power, these muscles at the bottom of your back, instead of using your hips and your legs. And you can certainly, when you paddle this way and you load up, you can certainly load more with your upper body as you do it. But the important thing is that you use your legs. Okay, and remember that whatever your legs do in the loading phase, they're going to contribute in the unloading phase by pushing up against the load that you have still on your paddle before you pop the paddle out of the water. If you don't bend your legs in the load, you can't use your legs in the unload, okay? So I just wanted to stress that as well, okay? Yeah, we'll just leave it at that for now because I've talked a lot. Are there any questions?
It's a fascinating presentation so far, Larry, and a lot of people are commenting about how much they're actually just learning from what you've shown them today. So, and yes, a lot of questions, but a lot of questions that I think you've already covered. Things like how do we activate the hips and the motion? Can you explain the pressure of the upper hand? Is it only down, or do you go down and front? So you've sort of touched on those.
Well, just with regards to the top hand, I would say that we want to make sure that, and it doesn't matter, I'm sitting down right now, so pretend I'm in a dragon boat. It's the same thing. The pressure is going to be directed straight down the paddle shaft. So imagine it trying to go straight down the shaft to the water. And what that does is it allows me to secure the blade in the water so that then I can pull against it, right? And you don't want to think about pushing down and forward with your top hand, because notice if there's a lot of forward motion from my top hand, what it does to my paddle angle. My paddle angle quickly goes from positive to negative. In fact, it kind of rotates around my bottom hand like that. And we want to try to maximize our positive paddle angle, or keep the blade positive through to vertical for as long as we possibly can, and avoid it turning over quickly from positive to negative. So your paddle, your top hand pressure, and again, it's just pressure, it's just this. That's all it is, just that. It's not, you're not trying to drive it through the water by pushing your top arm all the way down like you're doing a pulley machine in the gym or something. It's just holding against the pressure, keeping your top hand high as you do it, and just creating pressure that goes straight down the paddle shaft. That reminded me of one other thing to talk about. Just a good trick for having a good exit and helping you to come to reload forward underneath the paddle in a timely fashion is to think about keeping your top hand high. Okay, so imagine here's my top hand on the paddle I've loaded. Notice it's above my head level. If it gets too low, my paddle is getting too negative. If you keep your top hand in front of your face or high up on your chest, it kind of forces you to do the reloading forward with your hips and coming up with your legs that we've been talking about. So think about keeping your top hand high. And then in this sense, obviously you're thinking about as you do it, you're thinking about as you reload forward, you're thinking about your hand coming kind of straight up like that, as opposed to like that, like Fiona and Connor were talking about in their session last Sunday.
Couple of questions about general questions for you, Larry. David asking, generally speaking, is it better to keep the board light with a kind of a pumping technique, or trying to get the board moving up and down as little as possible?
Let's see. Again, there's different approaches to this, and everyone's going to have their different opinion on it. But I would say that we want to try to keep our board on top of the water as much as we can. We know that our board gets on top of the water by taking weight off of our board and getting it onto our paddle. That gets it up to start with. And then the board climbs as it accelerates. And if you accelerate off the back of the stroke, like we've been demonstrating, your board will carry more speed and it will stay higher in the water between strokes than it will if you don't accelerate well off the back of the stroke. And then it becomes a question of, having a fairly rapid recovery or, return in the air, so that you don't give the board time to sink back down into the water. Especially on some narrow boards, like boards now are down to sub 20 inches wide, which is really narrow. They don't have as flat, as wide a planing surface as the older, wider boards do. And so although they're very fast and they cut through the water really easily, you get them up on top of the water, there's not a lot of surface to keep them on top of the water, and they sink back down more easily. So on these narrow boards, you have to have a quicker recovery to keep the board on top of the water between strokes. So I would say that is important. And then the other thing is that, you really don't want to have a situation where you start to get your board going like this. And I know that Connor has talked about on starboard boards, there's a little bit of flex in them, and it gives you that dynamic flex that kind of you can get into sync with your body movements, and it's going to help kind of propel you through the water. But the danger is, unless you're like, Connor's an artist and he's unique, and for all of us to try to do what Connor's doing, as I've talked about a lot already today, can be problematic. Because if you don't get that sync right, if you're trying to get your board to go up and down, the danger you run is that your board is going up and down. And if your board's going up and down, it's not moving forward as much, right? It's hard for a board to do both at the same time. So you really want to try to get the board up and kind of stay up, skip across the surface of the water, and keep it going forward. And the analogy that I will use is paddling into a headwind with chop that might be, like this high and fairly steep. And as you go through them, your board's going up and then smacking down, up and smacking down, up and smacking down. And you get to a point where you feel like your board's just going smack, 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 smack. If your board's doing that, it's not going forward. So I would say, think about keeping your board on top of the water, and think about trying to keep your board moving forward. That would be what I would focus on.
Interesting you're referring to Connor there, because a few people want to know, Larry, that who you think amongst the famous paddlers has the ideal paddle stroke, so that if newbies to the sport want to go on and study someone in video, is there a male and a female athlete that you would point to that you think has
well stroke? That's a question, and it kind of goes back to what I said at the beginning. It's dangerous to look at any of these people, as great as they are, and try to say, oh, one is the ideal, and then copy that one, because they're not you. And I think what is really a good idea to do is get as much video as you can and look at a number of the top people. So if you're a woman, you want to look at the top women. Look at Sonny, look at Fiona, look at Seychelles, look at, if you can find video of Annabelle Anderson and Candace Appleby, who don't race so much anymore, but who were great, find video of them and start looking at what they're doing and look for similarities in what they're doing with their paddle against the water. And then start to look at how they're moving their bodies to accomplish that. And then you can start to learn. And you can start to then think too, like, well, who is kind of the closest to me in terms of my height and my weight and my size and that type of thing. And then you could maybe get some hints on how to do what they're doing with their paddle to move the board forward. You can get some hints that would help you do it better yourself, based on what the person who's similar to you is doing. And it's the same if you're a guy. You look at Connor, you look at Boothie, you look at any of the top guys, and try to see who kind of is similar to you in terms of size and stature. And then, you've looked at what, how, because paddling well is like, it's like you're trying to solve a puzzle. or you're trying to solve a problem, and you've got each person has a different set of tools to solve that problem with, and you got to figure out the best way to solve it with the tools that you have, right? So look to see how these various people are solving the problem of how do you move your board effectively through the water, and then look to see who has a similar toolkit to you, in terms of size and shape and fitness and all that kind of stuff. And then maybe try to use some of the ideas that they're using and try them in your own paddling to see if they work for you. But I'm hesitant to try to copy anyone exactly, because I think that's the wrong approach.
Yeah, for sure. Now, we've got quite a few more questions, but do you have anything more, Larry, that you want to show us before you wrap up for your...
Well, the one thing I was going to talk about is tracking your board straight. And it's a fairly quick 3 things that you need to think about. I think it's important for new people. And I think too, like a lot of more experienced racers can be better at this as well. So why don't I do that for 5 minutes or so, and then we can take some more questions.
Yep, that sounds good. Let's do that.
Okay, so I drew these rails of a board on my floor here, and I'm going to use them as a reference to talk about 3 things that you can do to track your board straighter. So obviously we know why the board turns to the opposite side that you're paddling on, right? We're not paddling right along that center line of the board. Our board has width, so we're paddling out from the side of the board a bit, and eventually that's going to create a turning effect around the center line of the board, and it's going to turn to the opposite side. So the first thing we need to do, obviously, is think about paddling as close to the center line of the board as we possibly can. If we could paddle right down the center line, our board would always run straight. We can't do that. So what we have to do is we have to try to find a way to paddle as close to the side of the board as we can. And the easiest way to do that is to make sure that, like I demonstrated earlier, is that you're squared up. Is that your body, your top hand is over the water, and your paddle is square, not top hand inside the board and your paddle at an angle. Okay, your paddle's square and right up against the rail of the board. And the way that the board curves at the front of the board, it's straight where you stand the rails, and then they curve towards you at the front. You can get your blade up at the front of the board by the curve, and then get the blade buried so that as the board gets wider, the blade's already in the wide part of the blade is already in the water now, and the shaft can just go right along the side of the board. Okay, so there's the curve of the board. The blade can go in and get buried, and then by the time the board gets wider, the shaft is just running along the side of the board. And when I do it, I don't hit the side of the board, but I'm just millimeters away from the side of the board, just kissing along the side of the board. Occasionally I tap it when I'm in rough water, but I'm as close to the board as I can be with my paddle shaft without actually hitting it. And the blade, when the blade goes in the water, this part of the blade, use my dragon boat paddle, this part of the blade here, the shoulder of the blade, it is as close to the side of the board without smacking it, okay, when it goes in the water. And then it's buried, and now it can go down the wider part of the board and be as close to the board. So I'm as close to the side of the board as I can. That's the first thing you're going to have to do. And you can change the number of strokes that you can paddle on one side from, only like 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 to 20, just by bringing your blade closer to the center line of the board. Okay, that's the first thing. Second thing is weighting the opposite rail. If you come from a canoe background, you'll know that as you're paddling along, if you want to turn to the left, you weight the right side of the canoe, and the canoe turns to the left. If you want to turn to the right, you weight the left side, and it turns to the right. Okay, that's opposite to snowboarding, surfing, skateboarding, where you weight the edge that you want to turn to. So if you want to turn to the right, you weight the right edge and you carve a right turn. That's the way it works when you're standing at the back of your race board, surfing down a wave. But when you're paddling and you're in the middle of the board and you're on a displacement board, you know, that which most race boards are, they're not shaped like a surfboard. They're shaped more like a boat at the front. You want to weight the opposite rail. So occasionally, as you're paddling close to the rail, like we already discussed, and if you find that your board is still running to the opposite side, just put a little weight on your opposite leg and push that rail down into the water just a little bit, and it will bring your board back to the paddling side. You don't have to stand and keep that weight the whole time. It should be possible to just put a little weight on it for a stroke or two, make a correction, and then bring your weight back to a normal level board, as long as you're close to the rail of the board, okay? So weighting the opposite rail. And also, if you want to turn more quickly to the non-paddling side, you can just weight the paddling side rail and it'll help you turn more quickly. You can paddle out from the board a bit and you'll turn more quickly, okay, without having to do a step back pivot turn. So that's the second thing, weighting the opposite rail. And the last thing is to use the face of the blade. So if this is the side of the board, if you can put your paddle in the water like that, so that the blade face is open to the board a little bit. And as it goes in the water, you're kind of drawing the nose of the board over to the paddle. And so you put it in the water like that, and you kind of draw the nose, and as you bury it, it straightens out and does a straight pull. And that drawing the nose over, so you're entering out, again, I don't know how well you're going to be able to see my paddle blade, but instead of the blade being square like that, instead of being square like that, it's going to be going in the water just a little bit like that, and bury, and then straighten and pull. And so that's going to pull the nose of the board to the paddle. And so that's really a powerful way to make a steering correction. And if you do all three of those things, paddle close to the rail, and actually you can paddle underneath the rail. If you really have to make a big steering correction, you can actually paddle, you can actually lean out over the water a little bit more, get your top hand outside your bottom hand, and actually paddle underneath the rail of the board. And if you think about it, if you weight the opposite rail, the paddling side rail comes up a bit and exposes the underside of your board a little bit and makes it easier to get your blade underneath. So if you have to make a real drastic steering correction, you can actually paddle, weight the rail, get the paddling side rail up, expose the underside of the board, and then paddle underneath the board a little bit instead of just right along the rail of the board. So if you combine these three skills, maybe if you're drawing the nose as you paddle underneath the rail like that, you can turn your board really quickly to the paddling side, okay? Now, obviously, you lose a little bit of speed as you do that. Like the bigger steering correction you make, the more speed you lose. But you can make the small steering corrections that allow you to track straight for extended periods of time, like basically as long as you want, without losing any speed. And most people lose more speed changing sides because they're not quick at making their changes than they would lose by making steering corrections with their paddle on the same side. Okay, and that's really useful for paddling in crosswinds. That's a big thing because a lot of people, they can never change sides when they're paddling in a crosswind. They're stuck paddling only on one side. If you can even out your sides in a big, strong crosswind, you're at a huge advantage when you're racing. So that's the place where it comes in the most. But I also think that just you should be changing sides when you want to change sides, when you're tired, not necessarily when you have to keep your board straight. Another place where it's really handy, these skills are really handy, Connor alluded to this last weekend, was if you're racing sprints, if you're doing the 200. All the top guys are doing their whole 200 on one side now. They're not changing sides. So they're doing a little bit of this in the middle of their 200, and they're doing it at 90 95 strokes a minute, which is really something impressive. Okay, so that's tracking your board.
Yeah, just following on from that about the changing of the sides, Larry. Bastian, who also comes from a canoe background, just wanted to know, why do you have to paddle on both sides? Because I have all the control I want paddling on just one side, and I'm a lot slower on the other side. I mean, I suppose for 18-kilometer race or 27-kilometer race, paddling on one side might get a little bit tough on the body.
Well, yeah, so I'll tell you a funny story. My first ever paddleboard race was in January 2011 in North Carolina at a race called the Surf to Sound. And it was on flat water. It was all on the intercoastal. And it was 10K, and I did the whole race on my right side because I'd only just started stand-up paddling, and I felt rock solid balance-wise and very powerful on my right side from all my years in canoe. But on my left side, I didn't feel very balanced, very stable, and I wasn't as powerful. And every time if I tried to go to the left, I would fall behind, and I'd feel like I was going to fall in. So I did a lot of paddling on my right side in my early races. I still paddle on the right. It's my go-to side. So if I'm downwinding and I want to catch, a bump, I really go for it. The right side is a better side for me. If I'm doing starts and races, I'm on the right side. If I'm setting up the finish of my race, I set up so I can do it on the right side. If I was going to do a 200-meter race, I'd do it on the right side. But I have to say that being in the exact same position as was it Bastian? Yeah, in the exact same position as Bastian was many years ago, I discovered that there is a huge advantage to being competent on both sides. And I would strongly suggest that you invest time into your weaker side. I spent a lot of time over the last decade learning to get better on my left side, and it's a huge help. It's a huge advantage. You get tired on one side, you can switch, and you're fresher on the other side. And I see the difference. I have my GPS mounted where I can see it. I see the difference in my speed right away on side changes. Paddling in rough water, sometimes no matter how much you'd like to paddle on one side, it's better if you paddle on the other for catching bumps, whatever. And if you don't have the ability to change sides, you're putting yourself at a real disadvantage. As I mentioned, paddling in crosswinds, even if you have all kinds of control on the side that you paddle on and can keep your board going straight, I guarantee you can paddle faster stroke rate on the opposite side in certain conditions, because you don't need to be doing all the steering stuff. And even when you're really good at the steering, it is a little bit of extra work, and it does slow your stroke rate down just a little bit compared to just being able to paddle without having to worry about steering. So I would say that if you're at that point where you're just transitioning from canoe and you've got one side that's much stronger than the other, obviously you want to use that side as much as you can when you're racing. But in your training, you're not going to forget how to paddle on your good side. That strength is never going to go away. It will be with you for the rest of your life. So you don't need to work on it every day. Spend some time in training trying to bring your weaker side up to close to the same level as your strong side. And it will make you down the road a much, much better paddler and a much better racer.
Larry, I'm quite conscious of the time. We've taken up a lot of yours, and it's breakfast time in Toronto, so you must be starving. But thank you so much for your time today, for giving us all this time and all this incredible information that is just so valuable for anybody at any level in the sport. For those, and there's a lot of questions we didn't get to today, but please, Larry will not mind at all if you contact him directly. If you go to Paddle Monster, that's his coaching online course. He will be able to provide you with more information. Quickly, Larry, somebody wants to know, will you be available? Will you be in Hungary for the World Championships to provide some training sessions there? Are you planning to go for the World Championships next year?
My plan is to go. I would, that's the idea right now. Obviously, it's contingent upon the state of the world with regards to COVID. And I do have, my mother is 90 years old. She's doing really well. But it's always, at this point in her life, it's always contingent on her health as well. She lives in the house I grew up in, and she's alone in that house. So I don't want to leave her for long periods of time unless I know that it's okay to do that. So there's a couple of things I always have to check now before I travel, and that is a big one. But my plan is to go, and if I'm there, I most certainly will make myself available to do clinics. And I know the ICF in China, you guys did a lot of coaching sessions, right? And I would be honored to participate in those sessions as well. So you know, that's something I'm working towards and hopeful I can participate in.
Yeah, I mean, we would love to have your expertise in one of those coaches. Really successful in China. We introduced a lot of beginners to the next level of performance, and the feedback we got was fantastic, and we know that it would be just as successful in Hungary. Larry, thank you so much for your time today. A lot of people just sending messages now saying your talk has been beyond awesome. I've learned so much. Really looking forward to watching this back to take more in. Great presentation. Thank you. You've learned so much today. This is incredible content. What a wealth of knowledge Larry is. Here.
Cheers. Thank you. Thank you. And Ross, could I just say, for those people that want more information, if you just go to paddlemonster.com, we've got a lot of information that's free on the website. A lot of posts that are free. And the other thing is we have a YouTube channel with a lot of videos. Some of the stuff that I covered today, some land drills that you can do, you know, in your house or in your backyard or whatever, with, you know, if you're frozen off the water for the winter, that help you with some of the things that I was talking about today. They're in those videos. And of course, I'm happy to, if anyone wants to reach out and ask questions, you can just reach me at larry@paddlemonster.com. And I'd be happy to try to answer your questions, as long as you're patient, because sometimes it takes me a while to get to those questions. But I'd be happy to help you out. So thank you, Ross, for the opportunity to do this today. Thanks to the ICF. Thank you to Starboard.
Yes.
Let's all grow this sport together, because it's an amazing sport, and let's get more people out on the water.
All right. Yes, thank you very much to Starboard. Yes, we echo Larry's sentiments there. Let's keep this sport growing. It is growing so fast, and it's fantastic to see everybody getting excited and getting involved. Larry, I better let you go and pull that tape off the floor. I hope you don't pull the varnish off as well when you rip it up, mate.
Hope not, yeah.